interest disclosure, a technical guide to an effective form. And this, I think, it sets out a really good explanation of the best practice guidance on what a form could look like, on the specific variables to consider, the types of information that one should think about. It is a very maximalist approach. So this particular form will, and the explanation accompanying it, will include every type of imaginable type of asset that somebody might declare. There's even mention of things like intellectual property rights, which might be relevant in some jurisdiction. So it is very, very expansive, this example, but you'd have to tailor something like that to the South African context to determine this doesn't make sense. We don't necessarily have to worry about that. But I think that there are some universal principles that I think make sense in every jurisdiction. And I think questions around beneficial ownership, the family member question, I think are particularly important and I think are very relevant to the South African context. Thank you.
Can I also just ask you to speak specifically to the STAR document that looks at financial disclosure in South Africa, which is a document that possibly, I mean, a lot of it highlights the problems of our form, but it is looking at a form in the context of our specific country. It's published a couple of months ago, May 2026, and it's at page 311.
So this document titled Financial Disclosure Form and E-Disclosure System of South Africa, this was an assessment conducted at the request of the Department of Public Service and Administration to both look at the form as well as the e-disclosure system and how it functions currently. So effectively what we've done in this report is the earlier documents I mentioned around designing an effective form to apply similar principles to the South African context to assess the current form against these international standards and good practice to determine what are some of the omissions in the South African context currently that should be considered and some of the priorities. So what I've done in the base document, the main note, is to really identify the most important issues that frame the overall context and challenges. But the second document on page 311, this gets into a lot more of the technical nitty-gritty according to each disclosure category to say these are the 2-3 additional pieces of information that one should ask about, for example, your property, your vehicle, etc., to have a more full form. And so this is, I think, when one considers, recommendations for reform or what this could look like in future, I think there's a lot of kind of more in-depth technical guidelines that we've prepared to share our recommendations tailored to the South African context.
If we move off the form,
we should, sorry to interrupt, we should not forget that Dr. Schoeman was to read the whole of 25, and I assumed even the sub-paragraphs. But please continue with your point, Mr. Shaskalsi.
No, we have actually reached the end of 25. Yes.
Must have been asleep. Apologies.
But to move off the form itself and then to the institutional and operational framework, assuming you get the form right, you still need an institutional framework that will respond to the information in the form. And this is the issue that you address from page 23. And maybe if you can,
Let me ask a question that I think goes to weaknesses, and which I think is relevant to what you have dealt with already. Some officials can be quite astute in hiding their wealth, and can fill in their disclosure forms in such a manner that no suspicion is raised. In such a case, and absent blanket lifestyle audits, what would trigger a review that may culminate in a lifestyle audit? I'm asking this because it is crucial that such officials should not fall through the cracks.
It's a very good point. So in the South African context, but also in international experience, one of the issues that can trigger a more substantive investigation, such as a lifestyle audit, is, for example, a whistleblower complaint or, say, an intradepartmental complaint that they suspect that there is maybe something suspicious happening with an individual that might warrant a more substantive investigation. But this is also a core part of the verification process, and why verification is so important. An official may lie on their disclosure form, and we would want to detect that. And part of the reason why I focused so much on the e-disclosure system and the question of integrations with existing databases is around how we can effectively measure the disclosures against the truth and verify that it is accurate and what they state there is correct. So in that verification process, if there are either discrepancies that come out that might warrant an investigation, but beyond that, good practice is to also consider additional investigations or complaints that may arise, or you might, in a case where you verify a disclosure and it's entirely correct, but there are some red flags that raise suspicions, and it might be a case of somebody having a very large financial means that you might question why is that? The form is entirely correct, but why is this person able to afford so much? Maybe that is something that then warrants further investigation. And so you can use a risk-based approach. We touch on this in the same document I mentioned previously on the e-disclosure system, around using a risk-based approach to determine where to prioritize your resources for these kinds of reviews, for the lifestyle audits. And in a context like that, you can identify certain priorities. So you say, for example, if somebody is in the senior management service, that's a high-risk function. If somebody is in supply chain management or a financial officer, that's potentially higher risk, and so we should apply more scrutiny. But you can also, using kind of an algorithmic approach, you can say if somebody has a certain type of asset, for example, cryptocurrencies, we might consider that being high risk. If we were to reach a point where you start applying, for example, machine learning, you might start learning specific profiles where, based on past experience, you know that if a disclosure form looks a certain way, they have these types of assets, or they have this level of income beyond their means. That is a classic example of, a high-risk situation. So we could reach a point where you start taking into consideration these additional indicators to identify red flags that then might be the basis for triggering a more intensive investigation or audit.
Mr. Jaskowski.
Thank you.
I have a question that is directed at you. I don't know if Dr. Schoeman is able to answer. To what extent does the current system where senior officials get the security clearance, to what extent does it look at assets and ownership and interests in things outside of your normal employment?
Details of it. It's supposed to do some form of lifestyle audit. The details of what is done, we haven't yet established, but we will.
Okay. And then, Dr. Schoeman, my follow-up question is, Is there any reason why, in respect of the senior generals, they cannot be this external verification of the disclosure forms? So something short of the audit, because it costs 30 to 50,000 per individual. But all the forms submitted by senior generals, they have an external verification mechanism to look for those things that chair says, they might complete it, but leave out a lot of detail that makes it difficult for an ordinary person to see that actually this is not a full disclosure.
I think this is a very good question. So the way these disclosures are currently verified for the SMS is through the Public Service Commission. So there is a program that leads on anti-corruption and integrity, and there's a unit that would do all of the verifications for the senior management service across the public service. And they would be your first line of verification that would look at the forms. I think the challenges that you mentioned, that this doesn't necessarily lead to anything right now, I think it's twofold. I think that the first challenge is, as I've mentioned, some of the gaps in the disclosure forms, and that how that leaves some deficiencies in areas that we might miss, the blind spots. I think the second aspect of it is, I think the current approach is largely about assessing compliance. Have people submitted their forms? Is it verified that the property that is mentioned is the same as the deeds registry? Is it the same as the NATIS system? Is it the same as the company's record? So I think the current system in its approach is not yet geared up to more substantively identifying the red flags that one would need to consider to determine whether more substantive investigation is necessary. And I think that's also, and I speak to this in the weakness of the institutional framework, I think it's also an issue of what kind of capacity we're using to verify these disclosures. So I mentioned within line ministries, it's an ethics officer. In the Public Service Commission, they have this unit that verifies these disclosures. But it's not necessarily that these people are investigators or have, strong training in anti-corruption. That's not to say that they have no training. I know that they do. But the kind of capacity that is needed for properly verifying these disclosures and for turning, red flags into an investigation, I don't believe is there just yet. And I think that's reflective in the results that we see, that all of these forms are verified and it turns up nothing.
Sorry, are you carrying on from this topic?
Well, it does link to that topic, but
Please go ahead.
but it's leading into a whole new section, so I think I'll ask your question.
Let me ask my question then. The e-disclosure system, you've stated that it pulls data from the two systems, the three, I think you say CIPC, in the NATIS and the Deeds Office for verification. Now, I'm mindful of the shortcomings that you say come with manual verification. What you haven't listed and maybe suggested is whether it should not be able to pull data from the SAPS system. Part of the things that have concerned is that you get these indicators of wealth and income, and then it seems the most obvious question is, well, why has SARS not picked this up? Is there a reason that this cannot happen? The same cannot be done with the SARS system?
I think it's a very good point, and this is something that I've definitely heard people speaking about in the public sector, and it's one of the issues that people think about often, and how that same kind of competency and systems and capability that you find in SARS, whether that could be applied to financial disclosures. The challenge of translating or using SARS's existing resources is that SARS has, in terms of its mandate, it's very restricted in disclosing taxpayer information, and that creates certain limitations. But the data that they ultimately use, that financial institutions are required to report to SARS, you could equally apply those same kind of standards to the financial disclosure function. And in fact, I understand the Financial Intelligence Center that there is a bill that has been, I believe it's still being tabled for comment, that suggests that the FIC might have a future role in providing the data needed for financial disclosures. So I think that's a very positive development, and it's a space where I think it's very important to start filling in those gaps of what kind of data is needed to properly and fully verify these disclosures.
I think building on your answer to Commissioner Kumalo's point, you deal at paragraph 26 with weaknesses in the current institutional framework and how this sort of process of verifying disclosures is dealt with in other jurisdictions. And maybe we can pick up there and go through the problems of the institutional framework as opposed to the disclosure form itself, and how that might be improved upon.
So let me read paragraph 26.1, because it sets out very clearly what the current system looks like, particular to the public service. So it says, in the current framework, so this is the Public Administration Ethics, Integrity and Disciplinary Technical Assistance Unit in the Department of Public Service and Administration, sets the policy framework and provides oversight. The Public Service Commission verifies financial disclosures and identifies conflicts of interest, which are then referred to line ministries. Ethics officers within line ministries conduct lifestyle reviews and verify disclosures below the SMS. The SIU proposes to lead lifestyle audits for all public entities, or this function is performed by external contractors, and any findings coming out of that are then referred either to SAPS or the Hawks for further criminal investigation, or to the individual line ministry for disciplinary action.
Can I just stop there,
Yes.
just to clarify? You say the SIU proposes to lead lifestyle audits for all public entities. Would that be for all individuals at SMS level within public entities, come what may, or would it only be for those whose lifestyle reviews have thrown up red flags? What is the proposal? Because the ethics officers verify disclosures below SMS. Who deals with SMSs, which would be the generals to whom Commissioner Kumalo was speaking?
So currently, within the Public Service Commission, they will verify the SMS, this is financial disclosures. The proposal from the SIU, and I'm hesitant to speak fully on their behalf, but effectively what they've proposed, and they've said this quite publicly, is that they would want to reach a point where there is a blanket proclamation that allows them to conduct lifestyle audits across the public sector, and that would then get around this current complexity around seconding officials to individual ministries to conduct these audits for them.
And of course, if there were that sort of proclamation, then they would be acting as SIU with the powers, the information gathering powers that the SIU Act vests in them.
I believe that's correct. So as I mentioned before, under these secondment arrangements, effectively, they function as if they were a member of that department rather than an SIU official.
Sorry, I've taken you away from 26.2, but I think it's important to get to 26.2.
Absolutely. So in 26.2, I effectively framed the same point from the previous paragraph to say that in most international examples, this kind of function would be in a single entity. And in South Africa, we've dispersed the same function across many different institutions that have a small part and small role to play in implementing the system. And this is only in the case of the public service, SAPS, etc., which follow the same framework. And that's also within the context of how we kind of have these different standards for elected officials, for local government, etc. And so I believe at a later stage, I mentioned the example of Botswana, but there are many other examples of this where this kind of preventative function is within a dedicated anti-corruption agency. It is seen as a single cohesive function because all of these different aspects of collecting disclosures, of setting the form, of verifying, of doing the follow-on investigations, all of these go hand in hand. And when you have this long chain of handing over responsibility effectively from one official to another, or one institution to another, you risk breakdowns in the chain if any of those institutions can't follow through on their specific function. But you're also dispersing capacity across all of these different institutions. And so the kind of line of sight and responsibility for this function starts getting a bit muddled and starts getting a bit lost on who exactly is responsible for this, who do we hold accountable if the system isn't functioning, because currently it is so widely dispersed. Later I speak to the benefits of having such a function in one entity around pooling resources, having consistent standards, developing the right kind of capacity, having the right access to databases, for example. If we speak to the issue around privacy concerns, for example, if one were to introduce access to individuals' financial records, would we be more concerned if there was a dedicated anti-corruption agency that had access to these records, or if, I think it's 42 national departments and 97 provincial departments, if each of them had a unit with access to these financial records and these kinds of privacy violations? So the reason why I mention that is that I think it's important that whatever entity has this kind of responsibility, they need to have a level of accountability. They need to have the access to the right resources. They need the capacity to perform this function correctly. Because as I've stated throughout, this is a whole value chain that connects to one another. And as soon as you have weaknesses in one area, it starts collapsing.
Now, just to pick up on that point, you mentioned it, in fact, in your statement, as opposed to your report, that you've done research for the National Anti-Corruption, is it NACAC?
That's correct.
I forget what the second A stands for.
The National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council.
Advisory Council. Now, the NACAC report has recommended the creation of an Office of Public Integrity. Now, presumably, if that recommendation is ever implemented, one of the functions of that office would be the centralized administration of, disclosure form assessment and investigation flowing from disclosure forms. Would that be correct?
So let me back up for a moment and speak to the work with the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, or NACAC. So I had engaged with NACAC over the course of their term. So they were appointed in 2022, I believe it was August. They ended their term August 2025. And so we had a relatively light level discussions with them for a long time, up until the last 6 months or so of the council's term, at which point their ideas started crystallizing around what this Office of Public Integrity would look like. And in our discussions with them, I think it became clear that I don't think that they had fully considered the financial disclosure function as being part of the preventative architecture or something that should be considered within a dedicated corruption prevention agency. And so upon realizing